My name is Alyssa Mercer. I'm 25 years old, and by November of 2024, I was living in a women's shelter in Canton, Ohio. Not because I stopped trying, not because I didn't want to work, but because every job I applied for around Stark County kept disappearing just when it looked like my life was finally about to start. I did everything people tell you to do. I finished school. I moved out. I fixed my resume. I showed up early. I shook hands and smiled and told interviewers I was ready to work. And almost every time, I walked out thinking I had finally found my chance. Then the phone would ring, or the email would arrive, and suddenly the position was gone. At first, the explanations sounded polite, a concern, a warning, something they had just learned. No one would say exactly what it was. Months later, I finally learned the truth. My parents had been calling employers behind my back before anyone could hire me, quietly telling them there was something wrong with me, that I wasn't stable, that I might cause problems at work. None of it was true, but it was enough to make every opportunity vanish before it could begin. And eventually, it left me standing in line for coffee at a shelter, signing my name on a clipboard every night just to keep a bed. Then, one afternoon, the front door opened and a woman I had never seen before walked in, looked directly at me, and said words that changed everything. "Your grandmother hired me to find you." Before I tell you what she placed on the table in front of me that day, let me take you back to the spring of 2024, the moment I still believed that if you worked hard enough, the truth would eventually catch up to a lie. The morning started the way most mornings did at Harmony House Women's Shelter. The coffee was thin, almost gray, and the smell of disinfectant hung in the hallway outside the kitchen. A line of women waited quietly with plastic trays in their hands. No one made much eye contact. Everyone had learned that mornings here were about getting through the next 15 minutes, not asking questions. I stood near the back of the line and watched steam rise from a dented coffee pot on the counter. Outside the windows, the sky was pale and cold. Canton in November had a way of making everything feel heavier than it already was. Harmony House sat on a quiet street, a few blocks away from downtown. It used to be an old brick apartment building before it was converted into a shelter. The front desk sat behind a thick plastic window, and a laminated sign listed the rules. Lights out at 10, no guests, everyone had chores. That morning, I carried my tray to a small table near the wall. Oatmeal, half a banana, coffee that tasted like warm water. Across the room, someone laughed too loudly at a television playing morning news. The sound bounced around the room and then faded. I wrapped both hands around the cup just to warm my fingers. 6 months earlier, my life had still looked normal. I grew up 30 minutes west of here, in Massillon, Ohio. My family had lived in the same house for more than 20 years. A quiet street with maple trees and trimmed lawns, the kind of neighborhood where people waved when they drove past each other. If you asked anyone in town about the Mercer family, they would have said the same thing. Good people. My dad, Daniel Mercer, had worked at Mid-Ohio Components for most of my life. He started there when I was in elementary school and worked his way up until he was plant operations manager. People respected him. He knew the owners of half the small manufacturing companies around Stark County. My mom, Patricia Mercer, worked as the administrative secretary at our Methodist church. She handled the office and organized volunteer events. People trusted her with everything from prayer lists to fundraising drives. My older brother Brian was the pride of the family. At 31, he was already selling houses through Summit Valley Realty in Canton. My parents liked to talk about his listings at dinner like they were family victories. From the outside, we looked like a normal American family. Inside the house, things felt different. Brian always seemed to move through life with the wind at his back. My parents called him driven, focused, responsible. When they talked about me, the words were softer, confused, still figuring things out. I heard those phrases so often that eventually they started to sound like facts. The moment I understood where I stood in the family came in 2022. I had been saving money for community college for years, a small account my parents helped set up when I was younger. It was supposed to cover tuition and books. One evening, I opened the account online and saw the balance was nearly gone. I walked into the kitchen where my parents were sitting. What happened to my college fund? My dad barely looked up from the newspaper. We had to move some money around. My mom nodded gently. It's still helping the family. A week later, I found out what that meant. Brian had just closed on his first house in Canton. My money had helped cover the down payment. No one ever said the words out loud, but the message was clear. Brian was an investment, I was an expense. By the time I finished my program at Stark State College in 2023, I had stopped expecting fairness. All I wanted was space. At the beginning of 2024, I told my parents I wanted to move out and find a job. Something simple, office work, filing, reception, anything that would let me support myself. My dad listened quietly and then leaned back in his chair. "You're not ready for the real world yet." He said it calmly, almost kindly. That was the strange thing about him. He never raised his voice. He just spoke with the kind of certainty that made you question yourself. My mom reached across the table. "Your father just wants to make sure you're safe." Safe meant staying exactly where they wanted me. In April of 2024, I packed my car and moved into a small rented room in North Canton. It was nothing fancy, just a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over a parking lot. But it was mine. I started applying for entry-level office jobs around Canton, Akron, and Massillon, receptionist positions, filing clerk roles, administrative assistant openings, anything I was qualified for. The first interview came from a small transportation company called Lakeview Logistics. The manager shook my hand and asked a few questions about my classes and computer skills. When I left, he smiled. "You seem like a good fit." 2 days later, my phone rang. The same manager sounded uncomfortable. "We received a call about you." "What kind of call?" "A concern from someone in the community." The offer disappeared. I told myself it was bad luck. Then it happened again. An accounting office in Akron canceled a second interview after telling me they had heard something unsettling. A building supply store in Jackson Township stopped returning my emails after saying they planned to hire me. Each time, the explanation sounded vague, a concern, a warning, information we weren't aware of before. At first, I thought it was coincidence, but then I started noticing something that made my stomach twist. Every time one of those job offers vanished, it happened right after I had mentioned the interview to my mom on the phone. One evening, I sat alone in my rented room, staring at the notebook where I had started writing down the dates. Interviews, phone calls, offers that disappeared. The pattern was impossible to ignore. And for the first time, I started to wonder if the real problem wasn't bad luck. It might have been my family. I closed the notebook and stared at the list of dates until the numbers started to blur together. Interviews, follow-up calls, promises that sounded hopeful for about 48 hours. Then silence. Then another polite rejection. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the job market. Stark County wasn't exactly booming with office jobs in 2024. Plenty of warehouses, plenty of factories, not many places hiring a 25-year-old with a community college certificate and no real experience. But the pattern kept repeating. In May, I interviewed at a small accounting office in Akron. The building sat on a quiet street near downtown. The receptionist handed me a clipboard and smiled while I filled out paperwork. The office manager brought me into a small conference room. "Tell me a little about your classes at Stark State." I explained the office administration program, data entry, filing systems, basic bookkeeping software. He nodded a few times while I talked. You seem organized. When I left the office, he walked me to the door. We should have a decision by early next week. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in months: optimism. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my rented room. The same manager sounded different, careful. We received some information that concerns us. What kind of information? It came from someone in the community. He paused. They suggested you might not be a stable employee. The word stable echoed in my head after the call ended. A week later, I applied for a receptionist position at a building supply company in Jackson Township. The interview lasted maybe 15 minutes, mostly questions about scheduling and answering phones. The manager smiled when I stood up to leave. We'll call you tomorrow. The next day passed without a call. Then the next. When I finally emailed to ask about the position, the reply came back short. We decided to move forward with another candidate. By the middle of the summer, the notebook looked like a pattern map. One afternoon in July, I decided to try something different. Instead of accepting another vague rejection, I called an employer back. The job had been a file clerk position at a small law office in Akron. The interview went well enough that the attorney had mentioned starting paperwork. 2 days later, the offer vanished. I dialed the number again and waited. The attorney answered after 2 rings. I know you said the position was filled. Silence hung on the line. I just want to understand what happened. The attorney sighed softly. This conversation stays between us. Of course. Someone called about you. What did they say? They said you had behavioral issues. My hand tightened around the phone. Did they say who they were? Another pause. He said he was your father. The room suddenly felt smaller. I sat there listening while the attorney continued speaking. He said he was worried you might not be ready for a professional environment. The voice in my memory clicked into place. Calm, measured, certain. Daniel Mercer. I thanked the attorney and ended the call. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the wall of my rented room. My father knew a lot of people. When you spend more than 20 years managing operations at a place like Mid-Ohio Components, you meet suppliers, contractors, truck companies, warehouse managers, small business owners, the kind of people who talk to each other at trade lunches and Chamber of Commerce events. In small towns around Stark County, reputation travels faster than facts. A warning from someone respected can close a door before it ever opens. Once I saw it clearly, the pattern was everywhere. Sometimes the calls came from someone describing themselves as a family friend. Sometimes the message sounded softer. We're just worried about her. We just want to make sure she doesn't get overwhelmed. Other times, the stories sounded darker. One employer told me someone had warned them I might cause problems in the workplace. Another hinted that there had been concerns about my mental health. In September, something even stranger happened. I applied for an administrative assistant position with a small property management company in Canton. The interview lasted less than half an hour, but the owner seemed enthusiastic. You'd be answering phones and organizing tenant files. I can do that. He nodded. We'll be in touch. 2 days later, I received a short email canceling the offer. I called the office and asked if there had been a misunderstanding. The owner sounded uncomfortable. Someone claiming to be with County Social Services contacted us. What do you mean? They said you were part of a behavioral monitoring program. I almost laughed because the statement sounded so absurd, but the owner didn't laugh. The story worked. By early fall, my notebook had become a record of lost chances. At the same time, something else was happening that I didn't notice yet. Back at Lakeview Logistics, the owner, Harold Benton, had received that first call from my father months earlier. The conversation had struck him as strange. Something about the way my father spoke didn't match the person he had met in the interview room. Instead of forgetting about it, he kept the emails we exchanged. He wrote a short note about the call in his files. I didn't know any of that at the time. All I knew was that the walls around my life were closing in. By October, my savings account had almost nothing left in it. The rent for my small room in North Canton kept climbing. I packed my belongings into my car and moved to a cheaper place in Akron, a single room in an old house where the hallways smelled like cigarette smoke. Even there, things didn't improve. Occasionally, I would run into people who knew my parents, people who had watched me grow up in Massillon. Their smiles looked thinner now. One woman at a grocery store glanced at me and then quickly looked away. Word was spreading. By the end of October, my bank account balance dropped below the number I needed for another month of rent. I packed everything I owned into 2 suitcases and drove back toward Canton. Harmony House stood exactly where the address said it would be, a brick building with narrow windows and a metal sign beside the door. Inside, a receptionist slid a clipboard through a small opening in the plastic window. "Fill this out." I wrote my name slowly, Alyssa Mercer. When I finished, she handed me a thin blanket and pointed down a hallway. The room at the end held rows of metal bunk beds. One of them was empty. That night, I climbed onto the top bunk and listened to the quiet breathing of strangers around me, and I realized the campaign against my life had worked better than anyone could have expected. The first few nights at Harmony House felt unreal. I woke up several times thinking I was still in my small rented room in North Canton. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then the sounds came back. The creak of metal bunk beds, someone coughing across the room, the low hum of the hallway lights that never fully turned off. Reality settled in quickly. Every morning started the same way. A line formed outside the kitchen before breakfast. Some women talked quietly, others stood with their arms folded, half asleep. The staff handed out oatmeal, toast, sometimes scrambled eggs if donations had been good that week. After breakfast, everyone had a small window of time to shower or make phone calls. The afternoons were reserved for job searching. Harmony House had a small computer room with 6 old desktop computers. The machines were slow, but they worked well enough to open job websites and send emails. Each person had a time slot. My name was usually written on the board for 2 hours in the early afternoon. At night, the staff walked through the dorm room and turned off the main lights at 10. The hardest part wasn't the rules. It was the feeling that I had failed so completely, that this was where I belonged now. I kept thinking about the path that had led me here, the interviews, the phone calls, the notebook filled with dates and quiet rejections. Sometimes I would lie awake staring at the ceiling and wonder if everyone else in the room had a story just like mine. A few days after I arrived, I met Nancy Caldwell. She was a volunteer who came in 3 afternoons a week to help women with resumes and job applications. Nancy was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She moved slowly, but her eyes noticed everything. The first time we spoke, I was sitting at one of the computers trying to fix a formatting problem on my resume. Nancy stopped beside my chair. "You're new here." I nodded. "How long have you been looking for work?" "Since April." She glanced at the screen and then at the stack of printed applications beside the keyboard. "You've applied to a lot of places." I thought if I tried enough, something would work. Nancy pulled out a chair and sat down next to me. "What happened?" I hesitated for a moment and then started talking. Not the whole story, just pieces of it. The interviews that went well, the sudden phone calls that ended everything, the strange warnings employers kept receiving. Nancy listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands together and looked at me for a long moment. Sometimes the people who say they're protecting you are the ones building the cage. The sentence stayed in my mind long after our conversation ended. A few days later, I began to notice how closely Nancy watched the room when she volunteered. She spoke gently to everyone, but she seemed especially curious about my situation. Around the same time, I started working more often with Linda Garcia. Linda was the shelter manager. She was 43 and had a calm way of handling chaos. Every day she moved between the front desk, the kitchen, and the small office near the entrance. During my first week, she helped me register for a job placement program in Canton. One afternoon, she waved me toward the computer room. "You can stay on a little longer today. Thank you. We had a cancellation." She often found small ways to help people without making a big announcement about it. For a short time, things almost felt hopeful. Then one morning, Linda asked me to step into her office. The door closed quietly behind me. Linda sat at her desk with a folder open in front of her. "Alyssa, I received a phone call this morning." My stomach tightened. "From who?" "A woman who said she was your mother." I stared at the floor. "What did she say?" Linda leaned back in her chair. "She told us you had a history of taking money from people." My chest felt hollow. "That's not true." "I know." Linda held up one hand gently. "She also said you might cause problems here." The room felt smaller with every word. "What happens now?" Linda closed the folder. "Right now, it just means we have to document the call." Her voice softened. "I haven't seen anything here that concerns me." But the message was clear. Even here, my parents had found a way to reach me. Later that afternoon, I was sitting alone at one of the tables in the common room when the front door opened. A woman I had never seen before stepped inside. She looked to be in her mid-60s, with short gray hair and a dark coat. She walked directly to the front desk. "I'm looking for Alyssa Mercer." The receptionist pointed across the room. I stood slowly. The woman approached me with steady steps. "Are you Alyssa?" "Yes." She extended her hand. "My name is Rebecca Collins." I shook her hand, confused. "What can I help you with?" Her expression softened slightly. "Your grandmother hired me to find you." The words landed like a sudden shift in gravity. "My grandmother?" "Margaret Hale." I sat down without meaning to. Rebecca pulled a chair closer to the table and opened a leather briefcase. "Your grandmother became concerned about your situation last year. She asked me to keep an eye on things." Papers slid onto the table in front of me. Printed emails. A list of phone records. Rebecca set a small recorder beside the stack. There were calls made to several employers. My hands felt numb as I looked at the documents. Some of the company names were already familiar. Lakeview Logistics, the accounting office in Akron, the building supply company in Jackson Township. Rebecca tapped the recorder lightly. These conversations were documented. I stared at the device and then at the pages again. The pattern I had written in my notebook was sitting there in black and white, only now it wasn't just my suspicion, it was proof. I leaned back in the chair and tried to steady my breathing. For months I had wondered if I was losing my mind. Now I understood something much more important. Someone else had been watching this happen, and someone had believed me before I even knew I needed help. 2 days after I met Rebecca Collins, she asked if I could be ready early the next morning. We left Canton just after sunrise. The sky was pale and the highway was still quiet. Rebecca drove a dark sedan that smelled faintly of coffee and leather. I sat in the passenger seat with my notebook in my lap. Neither of us talked much during the first half hour. My mind kept drifting back to the stack of documents she had placed on the table at the shelter. Every page had made something clearer and more frightening at the same time. Eventually, the buildings around us grew taller. Downtown Cleveland appeared ahead through the morning haze. Rebecca turned into a parking garage beside a glass office building and shut off the engine. "We're meeting someone who can look at what we have." I nodded. Inside the building, the lobby floors shined like polished stone. Rebecca led me to an elevator and pressed a button for the 12th floor. When the doors opened, we stepped into a quiet hallway with a row of office doors. One of them had a small sign that read, "Laura Whitaker, Attorney at Law." Rebecca knocked once and pushed the door open. A woman stood from behind a desk as we walked in. She looked about 48, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything at once. "You must be Alyssa." "Yes." Rebecca placed her briefcase on the table and opened it. "We brought everything." Laura Whitaker motioned for us to sit. For the next hour, the room stayed quiet except for the sound of papers moving across the table. Laura read the emails first, then the call logs. Finally, she picked up a small digital recorder and listened to part of one of the recordings. Her expression did not change while the voice played through the speaker. Daniel Mercer sounded exactly the way I remembered: calm, controlled, certain. When the recording ended, Laura turned the device off and leaned back slightly. "This isn't a misunderstanding." My hands tightened around the edge of the chair. "What does it mean?" Laura folded her hands together. "It means someone has been interfering with your employment opportunities." Rebecca nodded. "The pattern is consistent." Laura glanced again at the notes Rebecca had gathered. Multiple employers, similar statements, the same person making the calls. The room felt strangely steady while she spoke. For months, my life had felt chaotic and confusing. Hearing someone describe the situation in clear language made everything sharper. "What happens next?" Laura tapped the stack of documents. "We organize this." She slid a blank legal pad towards herself and began writing. Employers contacted, dates of calls, statements made. Then she circled several lines and looked up. "We build a record." The conversation moved quickly after that. Rebecca described how my grandmother, Margaret Hale, had contacted her the year before. Margaret had worried about the way my father talked about my future. He wanted to control every step. Rebecca spoke calmly as she explained how she began documenting things once the job calls started happening. Laura listened without interrupting. When Rebecca finished, Laura closed the folder and rested her hands on top of it. "Your grandmother saw something early." I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness hearing Margaret's name. Laura continued organizing the papers while Rebecca mentioned one more detail. Margaret also set aside a small trust account. Laura glanced up. "For Alyssa?" The word trust echoed in the quiet office. She wanted a safety net. I sat there absorbing everything that had unfolded in the last 48 hours. For months, my life had been shrinking. Every job lost, every door closed, every rumor whispered. Now, suddenly, there were people speaking calmly about evidence and records and decisions. By the time Rebecca and I left the building, the sun had climbed high over the Cleveland skyline. The drive back to Canton felt shorter. Life at the shelter continued the same way it always had. Breakfast lines, computer schedules, quiet evenings in the dorm room. But something underneath the routine had shifted. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca stayed in contact with Laura Whitaker. More documents were gathered. Several employers confirmed what had happened when they received those strange phone calls. The information slowly became part of official records. In a town like Massillon and the surrounding Stark County communities, news travels fast. Once the documents started appearing in public filings, people began talking. At first, the conversations stayed quiet. A few curious questions at church, a couple of puzzled looks in grocery stores. Then the calm voice on the recording circulated among local business owners. The calm voice on the recording was easy to recognize. Daniel Mercer had spent 2 decades building a reputation across the region. People trusted him because he always sounded reasonable. Now, that same voice sounded very different when placed next to the evidence. Weeks passed while the paperwork moved through the system. Rebecca visited the shelter occasionally to update me. Nancy Caldwell always seemed to notice those visits. She would glance toward the door with quiet curiosity, but never asked direct questions. Linda Garcia watched the situation carefully as well. The call from my mother had made things uncomfortable, but the growing stack of documents told a very different story. By early spring, the situation had moved into a place I had never imagined. One morning, Rebecca called and asked me to meet her outside the courthouse in downtown Canton. The building stood several blocks from Harmony House. Its stone steps rose above the sidewalk, and the Stark County seal was carved into the front wall. Rebecca waited near the entrance, holding a slim folder. "Ready?" I nodded, even though my chest felt tight. Inside the hallway, people moved quietly between offices. The air smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. Rebecca led me toward a courtroom door and stopped. Through the glass panel, I could see the rows of wooden benches inside. 2 familiar figures were already sitting near the front. My father sat perfectly straight, with his hands folded in his lap. My mother leaned close beside him. For a moment, I simply stood there, watching them. Then Rebecca placed a hand lightly on the door handle, and the courtroom began to fill. By the spring of 2026, I had a key on my own ring that opened my own front door. My apartment was on the 2nd floor of a brick building in Canton, not far from a grocery store and a bus line. The kitchen was small. The carpet in the living room had seen better years. The radiator clanked every time the heat came on. It was the most beautiful place I had ever lived in. On weekday mornings, I woke up before 7, made coffee in a machine I bought from a thrift store, and stood at the kitchen counter while the sun came through the blinds. Some mornings, I still had to remind myself that no one was going to ask where I was going, who I was meeting, or whether I was capable of handling my own life. I had a checking account with only my name on it, a used Honda Civic parked downstairs, a steady job as an administrative assistant at a logistics company in Canton. Nothing about my life looked dramatic from the outside. That was part of what made it feel so valuable. It was ordinary in the exact way I had wanted for years. The court case had ended the year before in Stark County Court. By the time it reached the hearing stage, the facts were no longer vague suspicions or private family arguments. Laura Whitaker laid everything out piece by piece: recordings, call logs, the notes Rebecca Collins had gathered, emails from employers who confirmed what had happened after my interviews. Harold Benton from Lakeview Logistics testified about the call he received from my father. He described Daniel Mercer the same way I had known him all my life: calm, reasonable sounding, controlled, certain enough to make doubt sound like common sense. That was what made the whole thing so effective for so long. My father never sounded wild. He sounded responsible. My mother was included too. Patricia Mercer had repeated some of the same claims to employers and later to the shelter. The court did not treat that as concern. It treated it as what it was: defamation, tortious interference with employment. When the ruling came down, Laura called me that afternoon. We got it. I sat in the hallway outside her office for a second because my legs felt weak. What does that mean exactly? It means the court agreed with the evidence. I closed my eyes. There was a pause on the line, and then Laura added one more thing. They don't get to do this to you anymore. The judgment required my parents to pay damages and stop all further interference with my employment. A lien was placed on the house in Massillon to secure enforcement. I did not celebrate the way people imagine you celebrate after winning something. There was no shouting, no dramatic crying, no speech. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired in the deep way that comes after fear finally loosens its grip. Word traveled through Massillon and the rest of Stark County faster than I expected. By then, the public records were easy enough to find. People who had once smiled at my parents in church hallways or at community dinners now had documents in front of them. Not rumors, documents. Some people avoided the subject entirely. Others stared too long when they saw me in public. A few tried to be kind in ways that came too late. One woman from church stopped me outside a pharmacy in Canton and pressed her hand against her chest. I had no idea. I looked at her for a moment and then nodded. That was all I had to give. I never moved back to Massillon. I never wanted the old street, the old routines, or the old explanations. Brian called once after the ruling became public. His number lit up my phone while I was sitting in my car outside the apartment. I let it ring twice before answering. Alyssa. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. What do you want? I didn't know how bad it was. I looked through the windshield at the building in front of me. You knew enough. He was quiet for a few seconds. I should have said something. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't enough anymore. I had spent too much of my life waiting for other people to develop a conscience at the right moment. I'm done carrying this for everyone. After that, he didn't call again. My parents never apologized in a way that meant anything. There were messages passed through attorneys, formal language, careful wording, nothing that actually named what they had done. No one wrote the sentence I had deserved all along. We tried to destroy your future because we couldn't stand losing control of you. Healing turned out to be quieter than revenge ever could have been. It looked like paying my electric bill on time. It looked like buying groceries without checking with anyone. It looked like hanging my own towels in the bathroom and leaving dishes in the sink for an hour because no one was there to turn that into a moral failure. Some nights I still woke up tense from dreams where I was back in my parents' kitchen and my father was explaining my life to me in that calm voice of his. But then I would hear the radiator click on, look around my own bedroom, and remember where I was. A few months after I moved into the apartment, Rebecca brought me an envelope that had been left with her by my grandmother, Margaret Hale. My name was written on the front in her careful handwriting. I sat at my kitchen table and opened it slowly. The letter inside was only 1 page long. She wrote that she had seen enough in her own life to recognize control when it dressed itself up as love. She wrote that freedom often looked smaller and less glamorous than people expected, but it mattered more than almost anything else. Near the bottom of the page was the line I have never forgotten. Freedom is the only inheritance I wanted you to have. I folded the letter back along its original crease and kept my hand on it for a long time. At 27, I was still building a life that many people would call modest. Small apartment, used car, administrative job, quiet evenings. But every part of it belonged to me. That was the point. If you've ever had to set a boundary with family just to protect your peace, I want to know how you handled it. And if you've ever had to choose your own future over someone else's version of loyalty, you can tell me that too.